Hey, Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the first week of our series, Faith That Works. It's a series where we're going to be walking through the book of James found within the New Testament of your Bible. It's a short book, only 5 chapters, but it's crammed full of practical advice for everyday life. You see, it does us no good to have a car that doesn't work, or a TV that doesn't work, or even a fridge that doesn't work. So why would we settle for a faith that doesn't work? We want a faith that is practical and meaningful in our everyday lives, that not only impacts how we live, but impacts the lives of those around us. So to kick off this series, Pastor Nate began by introducing us to the book's author. If you hadn't guessed it, his name is James. And James, he wasn't one of the 12 disciples. He was actually the half-brother of Jesus. You might not have known it, but from what we can glean from the scriptures, Jesus actually had 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and he even had some sisters. At the very least, Jesus had 6 other siblings, with James most likely being the second oldest in the family. Now, when James wrote his book, he was the senior leader in the church of Jerusalem. He was providing pastoral leadership to a large network of churches that had been scattered throughout the Roman Empire, which is why he wrote the letter. He wanted to provide some pastoral wisdom to those who were scattered abroad. Now, what's interesting is before James became a leader in the Christian faith, we see that James actually disbelieved or even doubted Jesus' claims. Mark chapter 3 verses 21, 31, and 32, Mark chapter 6 verses 1 to 6, and John chapter 7 verses 1 to 5 all record how Jesus' family had their doubts about him, which perhaps is comforting to you, because if you didn't grow up going to church, it sounds kind of crazy for some guy to claim to be God. I mean, you're in good company. His family thought the same thing. You see, understandably, Jesus' brothers and sisters, they needed or wanted more proof. And thankfully for them, they got it. 6 months later, all the proof they needed was provided. Jesus went to the cross, and then 3 days later rises from the grave, proving he has the power to conquer sin and death. And so guess who one of those people we're told saw the resurrected Jesus? If you guessed his brother James, well, give yourself a pat on the back. When Jesus rose from the grave, he intentionally sought out his younger brother James. I mean, can you imagine the reunion that those 2 brothers must have had? It took a resurrection for James to come to faith. James didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God until he actually rose from the dead. That's what it took for James to put his faith in his brother Jesus. But that was a game changer for him. He became an overnight believer. His life was completely transformed by what he witnessed. And so James and his brother Jude would go on to become prominent leaders in the early church. Now, when we think of the early church, you may think a lot about guys like Peter and Paul, who in many ways were the face of the early church as kind of Christianity got started. But what's interesting is 15 to 20 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, a major dispute broke out in the early church, and so a council in Jerusalem was established to resolve this dispute. And so all the major players, the highest ranking spiritual leaders, attend this council. Peter's there, Paul's there, Barnabas is there, everyone who is anybody was there. Each leader is given time to speak, and so after everyone has spoken though, guess who stands up and ultimately resolves the issue? If you guessed James, give yourself another pat on the back. James, who had spent his entire life studying the Old Testament. James, who was as familiar with the teachings and heart of Jesus as anybody else. James, who spent so much time in prayer that his knees had become calloused. James, who through pastoral insight had grown to become a man of great wisdom. James stands up and he speaks and he says, this is what we need to do. And Peter and Paul, the 2 guys who were the face of the early church, they submit themselves to his wisdom and authority. Needless to say, James is kind of a big deal. In fact, history records that the Jewish religious leaders so despised James, much like they did his brother Jesus 30 years earlier, that they took James to the top of the temple and they pushed him off. It was a public display of their disdain for Christianity. Apparently, though, James was a pretty tough old dude, because when he tumbled to the bottom of the temple and hit the ground, he didn't die. Legend has it that he actually got up to his knees and began to forgive those who had pushed him off. Naturally, this just angered them further, and so they picked up sticks and stones and they beat him to death. We're not sure how old James was when that happened, when he died, but according to church history, this event happened around 62 AD, with James being the pastor of the church in Jerusalem for the 20 or so years that preceded this. And it was sometimes during those 20 previous years that James actually wrote a letter to the Christian community beyond Jerusalem. And that's the letter we're looking at. And he opens his letter by saying this in James chapter 1, verse 1. He says, "I am writing to the 12 tribes, Jewish believers scattered abroad, greetings." The 12 tribes is a Jewish figure of speech that sometimes refers to Jewish people as a whole. These Jewish Christians had left their homes in Jerusalem, and so they were scattered abroad. Many of them were facing economic distress, including persecution at the hands of wealthy landowners. The middle of the first century in the Middle East was marred by famine that led to a great poverty in that region of the world. And so rich people were taking advantage of this opportunity to kind of buy up farmland and then force people to work the land on their terms. In order for those people to feed their families, it was a predicament that many of James' recipients would have found themselves in. They had left their homes in Jerusalem, traveling as far away as Syria and Turkey and Cyrus to escape persecution, only to try and establish a new life for themselves in a hostile environment where their faith wasn't supported and where wealthy landowners were taking advantage of their situation. And so James, their pastor, writes to them, and he seeks to encourage and admonish them with how to live out their faith under difficult circumstances. So James writes this in verse 2, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy, for you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow." Now, as Nate shared, the word tested is an interesting word because it's a term that the silversmiths would use back in their day when they would test silver. The way they would test silver is that they would put a bunch of it into a pot and then they would heat it up with a fire. When the fire reached a certain temperature, the silver would melt and all of the impurities would rise to the surface. The silversmith would then scoop that top layer off, getting rid of all the impurities. He would do this over and over and over again until the silver was fully tested and purified. And the way the silversmith would know that the silver was fully tested or purified would be if he could look down in it and if he could see his own reflection in the silver. That's when he knew his work was done, which is a beautiful picture of what God is seeking to do with our lives. He is testing and purifying us through our troubles, not to hurt us, but to actually grow us, so that when people look at us, they see God's reflection. It's why James goes on to say in verse 4, "So let it grow, for when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing." That word perfect is really important to James. He repeats it 7 times in the book. In biblical Hebrew and Greek, this word refers to wholeness. It means living a completely integrated life where your actions are always consistent with the values and beliefs that you've received from Jesus. James knows that most people live fractured lives with big inconsistencies in their character and their conduct, that there are gaps between what they say they believe and how they actually live it out. And James also knows, however, that God is on a mission to restore our fractured, inconsistent lives and make them whole, with the goal being to mature us and make us complete. Which is why God allows us to go through painful, difficult, challenging times. He doesn't cause them, but He also doesn't prevent them. The reason why God doesn't prevent our problems because that's not the line of work He's in. God's mission isn't to prevent problems, but it's to perfect people. That's what James wants us to understand. God doesn't prevent pain, He perfects us through the pain. Which is why James says to consider it pure joy when you go through trouble, because God is using it to perfect you. You see, the reason you can consider it pure joy is because suffering reveals our true colors. It proves whether or not our faith is the real deal. Said differently, crisis reveals our true character, who we authentically are. We can say that we have a peace that passes all understanding, but if we freak out and panic when a crisis hits, our true self is exposed. And so James says to his friends scattered abroad and facing persecution and hardship and mistreatment, he says, remain firm in your faith, because if you do it, it will produce joy rather than despair in your heart. And that's what makes us different. Everyone suffers, but followers of Jesus suffer with joy rather than despair because of our faith in God. And that's what makes us different. And that's a sign of a faith that works. Well, friends, consider yourselves caught up. Enjoy working through the discussion questions. I'll see you next time.